Computer games as they're designed today are noticeably very mechanical, formal systems of interaction between players and a machine. In their simplest forms, they're little more than Skinner boxes, time sinks designed to keep people in front of the screen simply by the virtue of having some form of risk versus reward system. But every game developer that matters has worked to build beyond the really basic stuff that perpetuates the stereotype of games as simplistic addictions. Granted, there are plenty of great games that can addict you without remorse, but their developers don't rely on replay value alone to get the job done. A truly great game takes its formal computerized systems and makes them more dynamic. It makes the challenge more complex. It adds scope to the area of play. It expands the concepts it introduces in synchronization with player progression, and so on. Conventionally, we see this sort of devotion in shooters with level design and AI that necessitate constant movement and dexterity, puzzle games that introduce entirely new concepts and form a challenge by mixing them with what's already been established, and strategy games that provide a hell of a lot of tactical options, but make every decision risky and precious. Just to vaguely describe a few examples. But those are all pretty regular occurrences in gaming, and they're mostly designed to elicit feelings of enjoyment or accomplishment or, at their most challenging, tension. Our spectrum of emotions is much broader than that, but so few games try to engage emotions beyond the few that we're familiar with in relation to computer systems. And I think that this is a damn shame. The interactivity found in gaming is exclusive to gaming, and it has been able to involve us in what's happening unlike any other artistic medium because it makes us more than just observers of what's happening. A few generous handfuls of games want to provoke sadness, despair, fear, love, spite, and all those other naughty, non-computerized feelings. But there's not yet a firmly established way to do that in games. So the large majority veers away from forming its own complex manner of expression and elects merely to copy the simpler means of expression found in uninteractive media. Most people are complacent with simpler manners of expression too, but I'm not. There should be more games that don't only tell a story or build a world, but also involve me in an appropriate way. There should be more games that focus on horror or drama or mystery and don't spoon-feed me down a path. There should be more games that present mature subject matter and actually fortify it with mature interactive systems. There should be more games like Pathologic. Pathologic is that unconventional kind of game, the kind that takes you out of your electronic comfort zone, perhaps more than any other game out there. At face value, it has more than enough problems that will keep most of you who watch this video from liking it, and if it was just about any other game, you would be in the right. It isn't a game ever to be taken at face value. After all you see at first in raw game footage is walking and some god-awful combat, but the underlying challenges in the game are something exhausting, strange, and remarkably complex. Pathologic is a game about critical decision-making and overcoming a seemingly inevitable demise. With the extreme detail and care taken to express the unconventional premise, comes the best and best told story in all of gaming, and with the uniqueness and intricacy of the unconventional challenges it delivers, comes one of the best games ever made. Pathologic is a game about surviving and dealing with a plague, so it can perhaps best be considered a survival horror game by the very definition. After all, it's about surviving in a pretty dangerous world. But it's not at all like the most famous titles in the genre. So what exactly does everything horror-themed have in common that could be avoided by a supposed outlier like this? But take, for example, in the Silent Hill games, you enter a town that turns out quickly to have been almost entirely replaced with grotesque, twitchy things that try to kill you. In Penumbra, you stumble into an abandoned mine and research facility overrun with violent creatures. In Doom 3, you land on Mars only to have nearly everyone turn into a zombie in about 10 minutes. In Cryostasis, the Sleep of Reason, you seek refuge from a sled accident on a Soviet icebreaker that has gone mad because of how Russian their situation has become. In these games, among myriad others, the worst to happen has already come and gone, and it's your job to set things right now that society has somehow screwed itself over completely. Pathologic is the only instance I know of where you don't begin with an immediately sinister setting. Instead, it's a game whose world is presently dying. It relies on an entirely different kind of terror, straying from everything widely established in horror games, whether it's the genuine, overwhelming immediate danger of amnesia or the flimsy jump scare tricks in the likes of Condemned. It's slower, larger, and infinitely more threatening than what any other game has attempted. In any other game, you're fixing what Doom has left in its wake. In Pathologic, you're facing Doom. And given the nature of the game, Pathologic faces you with a much more brooding form of horror. With immediacy comes mad animal fear, whereas with gradual decay and the threat of inevitable demise comes oppression and exhaustion. Because it has the intention of oppressing and exhausting you, the game doesn't focus on immediate threats, and it does a whole lot of things in ways that would have been undermined completely if it did. It's a survival horror, but it's set in an open world, it has a wealth of character interaction, it features quite a bit of combat, and it faces you with a lot of resource and stat management. The game takes place in a small, unnamed, isolated town somewhere on the Russian steppe, whose connection to the outside world is limited to a very lucrative meat exporting industry, eccentric theater, and some supernatural stories about its architecture and its seemingly immortal leader. When you arrive, as you'd expect, something goes horribly wrong, as Simon Kane, the leader, is found dead. And most people become quite panicky, wondering what to do now that their centuries-strong figurehead has fallen. The wealthier families all want to have their way with the place, and once it's revealed that the disease has struck the town, their disagreements shake its foundation. The villain of the story, for lack of a better term, is the Sand Plague itself. It's the manifestation of absolute evil, and it works with the story as it really enhances the depth of the characters, something ignored commonly enough in gaming. The plague is an unbiased, deadly force that acts against the best interest of everyone it affects. So the goal for everybody in town is to stop it or to survive it. Everyone you meet has hopes and fears and ideas about seeing the end of the disease. But just because there is an absolute objective force of evil doesn't mean there is an objective force of good. It just means that nobody wants to die. Instead, all of the characters are rich, layered human beings with diverse attitudes who reflect all walks of life, all of whom are designed to do more than merely continue the plot. Aristocrats, business people, officers, artists, merchants, housewives, and even children, wealthy and orphaned alike, all play considerable roles in society and hold their own perspectives on matters, and of course, they all have conflicts with one another. The plague has no motivation other than its natural function to spread, take its toll, and move on, and as a result, there's no personality at all to the villain. It can't create massive weapons or get caught in a power struggle or anything like that. The narrative is harrowing, filled with twists and turns, but the absolute evil is so blunt and simple that it has nothing to do with them. Instead, the story isn't action-driven, but character-driven. In other stories that deal with the conflict with an absolute evil, a big question is, what could the villain possibly do next? Here, its equivalent is, what will these people get me into next? Instead of the plague holding power and weapons to screw everything up, it's the people. And the actions of the people have so much to play off of. The town has its own history and is replete with folk superstitions and traditions. Every character has strong connections to other characters in parts of town and is influenced to act in their supposed best interests. When something happens that harms a character's agenda or the life he follows, he'll go to great lengths to reaffirm his own ideas through pandering, lying, and using pretty much any kind of rhetoric. And the best part is, if and when all of his efforts fail, he will change and develop into someone who is regretful, proud, disillusioned, grateful, or whatever, but always relatable. This is a game, however, and without connecting all of these characters and their stories to you, it would be a pretty pointless game. But in regards to its storytelling, just as much as its story, Pathologic is just perfect. It blurs the line between story and gameplay in a manner that hasn't been surpassed before or since its release. The game makes you just as much of a character as the ones you interact with regularly. You have your own in-game history and ambitions, and all your dialogue options reflect that attitude while still granting you a veritable degree of choice. Naturally, nearly all of the story is delivered through dialogue because of the extensive cast of characters, and a lot of dialogue with a lot of options means decision-making, and the process flows quite naturally. Most of the conversations you have raise very few stakes, but they all build character and give you new information to ponder. When times are hard and a character consults with you on what action to take, the build-up created by previously learned information is immense, and it becomes exceedingly hard to figure out what makes the most sense. Harkening back to the large cast of diverse, relatable characters, everyone mentions to you different ideas and opportunities that all make some degree of sense. Most decisions you need to make are presented in the form of either-or dialogue options, but there is a lot of interaction with a hell of a lot of characters, meaning that your situation builds up and that your decisions amass and affect all of these people in very different ways. As part of your character's own development, you become involved in the goings-on of a few different groups of people throughout the course of the game. You gain a reputation as a certain kind of person, and you can choose not to, but most likely you run with that reputation. But you aren't a lone hero who is the sole decider of potential ways to save the town. You play parallel to two other protagonists who come from other walks of life and ally themselves with other groups of people. Because of your common goal of stopping the plague, you normally work together when you meet with them or encounter a mutual friend, but they normally see matters from an entirely different perspective, and you find yourself making efforts against their wishes just as often. They offer arguments for their own cases that are just about as strong as you can make yours. And because everybody is just so worth interacting with and listening to, and because there is no objectively right answer to anything, figuring out what to do becomes a genuine challenge. This kind of interaction with the game world is the exceedingly unconventional kind of challenge I was referring to in my wordy opening. It's competition with a formal system, like in any other game, but it's something complex and previously untouched. The developers at Ice Pick Lodge consider this kind of competition a sort of co-authorship, as it revolves around entering a story whose situation is largely out of your control, and working with the characters to change that story to your own wishes. Plenty of games feature dialogue choices too, but not with the cleverness and intricacy of Pathologic. Take the widely touted Mass Effect, for example, where nearly every line Commander Shepard delivers is the result of swirling around a dialogue wheel. But the game puts a number of limitations on just how characteristic everything can be. There, the story is driven by the action, a series of events set in motion by an adversary you by and large can't interact with. And as a result of all the action, there is less weight on the main characters. They don't need to be, and certainly are not, anywhere near as great as the cast of Pathologic, which really hinders your connection with them when it's time to make what is supposed to be a hard decision. Your decisions and their implications also don't take priority over much else, because as long as you keep firing your weapon at people, you'll end up following the plot and saving the galaxy. Conversely, in Pathologic, a lot of decisions you make will cause you to lose something you really want or need, and it's entirely possible to decision-make yourself into a whole. Lastly, Mass Effect sort of backfires on making Commander Shepard relatable by making him so accessible such that his history and predetermined personality amount to a few options in a character creation screen. His limited dialogue options are often pretty simple and too focused on sounding like every space commander ever. Pathologic puts you in the role of someone who has a history and attitude of his own, but it allows you any option within reason, and isn't afraid of involving you in long conversations that really help build the world and enhance your perspective. Icepick's approach to storytelling is to make everything matter in some way. As you play through the story, your character and everyone else's have a forceful influence on everything you do, and the tough calls become even tougher to make as you forge new alliances and learn what some people may not have wanted to reveal. You begin to value the well-being of others just as much as you value your own life in a game, if not more. I know I did. This plays right to the end, too. In my experience, I had formed connections with other townspeople so strongly and become torn between their ideologies. I investigated my way into the possible causes of the plague and felt my blood run cold as I encountered the most powerful plot twist ever, only to have it run even colder as the plot twisted even further not much later. What happened on the final day of the game was, because of everything I'd experienced and all the relationships I'd forged, quite honestly the hardest decision I've ever had to make in my life. Perhaps what is most unique about Pathologic's story, though, is the multiple protagonist system that I mentioned in passing earlier. When you begin playing, you have the choice of 3 protagonists, or 2 who are immediately available, and 1 who unlocks after one play through the campaign. You can choose from Daniel Dankovsky, a Bachelor of Medicine whose research into death leads him to pursuing the attention of the town's immortal leader, Artemi Borach, the Haruspex, commonly misspelled and mispronounced as Haruspicus, a man trained in odd rituals and organ removal techniques who is framed for murder, and Clara, a mysterious girl or devotress who makes grandiose claims of mystical abilities to heal the sick. What's so great about having 3 protagonists is that the game allows for a much larger fleshed-out world than what could be experienced through only one pair of eyes. Each protagonist has his own complete story, and they all have the same goal of ending the plague, but their individual narratives branch off into different parts of town, with entirely different relationships to the characters and very different attitudes. Games that have this system normally amount to shooters that recycle environments to increase longevity, but Pathologic doesn't recycle its story across the playable characters apart from the basic premise. As the game introduces new characters in new ways, it introduces different problems that need to be solved, and new perspectives on the problems you had to solve in a previous playthrough. All of this storytelling brilliance comes with one caveat, though, specifically one for people who can't speak Russian. The writing is strong and nuanced, at least from what I can tell, but Pathologic is an under-budget Russian game with a script that touches the clouds when stacked. As a result, the translation to English is pretty poor, and while most of the flaws lie in really simple grammatical or spelling mistakes that anyone can still understand, parts of the dialogue lose nearly all meaning at the fault of some translator who really didn't understand English. This isn't much of a problem for me because I know enough Russian to understand some of the sentence structure that didn't get rebuilt properly in English, but it still took some work to understand some of the characters at certain points. It's not quite as bad as the translation featured in Outcry, but it's pretty damn close. I don't think it's game-breaking, but it's definitely a problem, and it can definitely hinder your understanding of the game. But the story is only one half of Pathologic's challenge. It's complemented by what happens in between conversations, as you travel across town. It's something that you may perceive, as I mentioned earlier on, merely to be a matter of walking from place to place and partaking in some god-awful combat. But as you move around town from character to character, something much better comes of the gameplay. First off, though, I'm not going to dilly-dally around the fact that the combat does in fact suck terribly. The game presents its character interaction in a manner similar to quests in an RPG, in that you talk to someone of interest and then you receive a quest to pay someone else a visit down the road or across the river to consult with him about whatever issue is at hand. As you walk through the town, you'll occasionally encounter some people or animals who want to attack you, like thugs at night or rats in infected parts of town, and the way you deal with them couldn't possibly be any worse. When an enemy spots you, he locks onto you and will not stop chasing you or throwing things at you until you manage to reach a considerable distance away or until you kill him. Killing is nothing but a matter of taking out a knife or scalpel, backpedaling and tapping the left mouse button repeatedly. It's especially stupid when you encounter plague rats the size of cats, which are pretty hard to hit, that want nothing more than to attack you and you specifically. I really believe that the combat is barely an issue, though, considering everything else that Pathologic has to offer. As I said earlier on, the game is about a brooding feeling of inevitable demise, and that's not something you can get out of immediate threats like men with knives. Enemies only exist because violent looters and such make sense given the execrable state of the town. Hostiles exist to drop some loot if you're lucky, or to make you tread carefully around more dangerous parts of town. The game focuses on threatening you passively. The most major element that keeps you on your toes is time, and while it's simple, it's excruciatingly effective with every other survival element piled on top of it. The story is split up into 12 days, with each day ranging from 2 to 4 hours depending on how much you sleep, how much you engage in conversation, and so on. You're on a constant timer that only stops for dialogue and some in-game menus, and you're beset by daily quests that end at midnight. Because of the dire nature of some quests, if you don't complete them in time, important people will die. Walking from place to place takes up plenty of time, and with a whole bunch of other necessities piled onto you, time becomes a valuable commodity. As an aside, this means it's sometimes entirely necessary to give up on some quests because time is too short, which also affects which parts of the story unfold. One of the biggest feelings that the game concerns you with is the idea that you are just a regular human just like everyone else, so time is just the tip of what you need to worry about to survive. You're just as susceptible to hunger, fatigue, and the sand plague as any of the common folk. This means that you need sleep, food, health-restoring items, immunity-boosting drugs, and infection-stopping drugs for when your immune system just isn't enough, and all of that is hell to balance. The town is small and normally isolated, and after the plague strikes, it's quarantined entirely. There is no import of helpful goods, so resources can only be found in small quantities across town. You're desperate to survive, so you'll be spending most of your precious time searching for anything valuable along the paths you tread throughout the day. If there is something that you need but can't find, you'll need to pay, trade, or steal. Shops around town are the most reliable sources of goods, stocking fairly regularly with just enough items for you to survive. But the state of the economy is dreadful as all commerce with the outside world has halted. Everything apart from the least significant trinket is costly, and this can lead to some pretty desperate exchanges as you hand a smug shop dealer a nice coat and a gun for some bare necessities. But chances are you'll be trading with townspeople just as much as you'll be dropping an arm and a leg for some of the less common items, and the trading system is probably one of the most interesting challenges the game presents. Most townsfolk can be invited to trade with what little they have for what little you have, yielding certain items depending on what types of NPCs they are. Drunks will gladly give you their stuff only for a few flasks of water to help sober themselves up. Children will accept just about any trinket, be it a flower or something sharp, in return for things like medicine and ammunition. The things you get out of these transactions aren't much, but normally they can keep you alive, or if you're confident enough, they can be sold in shops for more money. Stealing is also a viable option, but also one of the worst parts of the game. You can buy lockpicks from Griff, the town's thief, or acquire them from some thugs you've killed, and use them on houses. Once you're inside the house, you can trade with some of the people in there and then steal all of the things from their cabinets, but the whole thing is piss easy. The AI is terrible during combat, but it's even more inept when you're rummaging through its things. All women and children do when they spot you raiding their things is run around silently, and the men of the household will not attack you at all unless you take something while in their direct line of sight. Unless you manage to kill somebody somehow, nothing actually bad will happen to you, and you can beeline right for the exit free of consequence. You can also forage through infected houses, which are unlocked, but the environment inside is extremely dangerous. You run the risk of contracting more of the disease as you go through what remains of the dying household's belongings, so it's a very tense maneuver, but it does yield its benefits. It's a particularly better experience than robbing someone's house because it doesn't deal with laughably bad AI, but it's also much harder. In the most desperate situations, you may have to kill others to get what you need, and instead of judging you as a good person or a bad person, the game merely reflects your decision to kill the innocent in its reputation system. The reputation system determines how the general public and possibly some main characters will react to you. If rumor has it that you're killing a fair amount of people to get to your own desires, people will attack or run away, and you'll need to make amends by tending to the sick, killing thugs, or doing other beneficent things. It's one of the more contrived and computer gamey systems, but it really is effective. Pulling all of this survival off is a big deal on its own, but it becomes even more distressing as the town changes. Diseases don't stay complacently in one spot. Instead, they survive by spreading, and the game reflects this by infecting new districts of town each day. Infected areas are populated by shrouded people, plague rats, and clouds of the plague itself. At first, it's a little awkward and even somewhat silly to find out that the plague travels in clouds, or that some of the infected actually try to infect you, but it works. Soon enough, it's easy to suspend your disbelief of how the plague is executed simply because of how dangerous it is. Plague clouds will settle in the middle of the road waiting for you to walk right into them, or ride the wind through the air, and it's really nerve-wracking to avoid them. Houses in the infected districts are infected naturally, and as I mentioned before, going inside them is pretty dangerous. The infection takes sizable parts of town too, so you may find yourself having to travel through them quite often for convenience sake, despite the toll it can take on your well-being. Over the course of the 12 days, new NPC types are also introduced to the town in accordance with the narrative. Sometimes they're friendly, and others they're new threats for you to deal with. In one very important case, they're both. All of that becomes a hell of a lot to worry about as it amalgamates. The scarcity of resources and your person's human frailty combine devastatingly with the fucked up economy and the spreading plague. The difficulty fluctuates depending on what you have to do each day, but the game is almost always extremely hard. Despite how ridiculous this may sound, Pathologic is a really hardcore game. It's unrelenting in its survival mechanics, and pretty dynamic in its representation of the town. But it's also somewhat problematic, to say the least. Pathologic lacks quite a bit of polish in an area that is impossible to overlook. The engine itself can be unstable, and you do best to quick save pretty often, as well as save manually between days, because it's possible to encounter a crash or even a quest that simply doesn't work. Comparative to something known for its instability like Stalker Shadow of Chernobyl, it's not actually so unstable, but any event gone wrong can still ruin your day. Also, and this is a massive turnoff, the first day of the story is handled extremely poorly. From a gameplay perspective, it's designed to serve as a tutorial and to acquaint you with important parts of town, but it doesn't mix the two in any way. The tutorial is mostly delivered through semi-cryptic dialogue at the start of the day that leaves a lot of questions completely unexplained. Most of the rest of the day has you walking from important place to important place, listening as people introduce themselves, and it's tedious as hell. The tutorial messages could have been used to guide you through the first day, instead of just throwing everything at you at once. And furthermore, the tutorial messages could have explained a lot more actually necessary things. For instance, the different in-game menus all correspond to odd symbols that appear in the corner of your screen, and most of them become clear soon enough, representing things like your map and your quest updates. But they are never actually explained. On my 6th day, I finally paid attention to a strange symbol popping up along with a page-turning sound, and I had no idea what it was. It turned out that I was halfway through the game, and I completely missed the fact that I could press L to access letters that I'd been receiving daily from characters in the game, giving me information on places to go and people to meet with, all of which I had only managed to accomplish previously by walking around town aimlessly. And the first day quests don't really make much sense in context with the story either. You familiarize yourself with walking around town, sure, but the town's leader has died, and absolutely nobody is gathering at all. You need to walk across town a whole bunch of times fetching words for other people. Even members of his family are staying in their own houses, and you have to go and talk to them all one by one. It's a mind-numbingly tedious process, and while fortunately it doesn't reflect the rest of the game quite as much, it definitely overstays its welcome. Pathologic is a pretty big mixed bag aesthetically, but it creates an extremely effective atmosphere. One of the atmosphere's greatest components is its scale. The town is pretty compact for an open world, and I don't mean that in a bad way, by the way, but it's capped on each end by massive alien-looking structures. On one side, by the rich part of town, is the polyhedron, an architectural marvel created by an artistically inclined drunkard that seemingly ignores the laws of physics and remains supported by nothing but a staircase. On the other is a combination of a meat processing plant known as the abattoir and an asylum known as the apiary, which forms the heart of the town in more ways than one. With their scale and mysterious guise, they loom off in the distance and blanket the sky as you get closer, producing this extremely otherworldly, intimidating effect. The abattoir and apiary in particular are extremely unsettling because of the apprehension inherent in all of the rumors of what actually takes place inside them. They remain as an extremely foreboding presence, perhaps even as a threat, off in the background until you finally enter them. That is, if you ever get to, and they all play large roles in the story. The town itself feels extremely unusual, in both a good way and a bad way. At first, the fog obscuring the draw distance and the lack of nearly all shadows are pretty obvious concessions made because of the dated technology, but they end up working surprisingly well with the atmosphere similarly to Silent Hill, but with a reasonable amount of light and visibility. The soundtrack is also this very odd electronic stuff, and at first it seems unfitting given the age of the setting, which I'd posit is roughly a century ago, but it grows on you and starts to fit the actual situation. Quite a bit of it is actually really good too, and the songs feature different styles, normal, infected, and action, depending on the current state of the area you're in. The game also has a theater motif to it that ties into some of the characters, and of course, the theater near the center of town. Each day, you can pay a visit and listen to a pantomime recounting what transpired, and you'll also encounter minor, pretty mysterious characters dressed in theatrical costumes at points throughout the game as well. As best I can understand, the theatrical element exists to accentuate how the setting is directed against you and how you play a very sort of dramatic role, and as an homage to some of the ideas that originally spawned the game. The whole thing doesn't resonate so much with me, but it's pulled off quite well, and as far as I'm aware, wholly unique in gaming. The visuals of the game are pretty technologically dated, just as they were back when the game was released, but the team at Ice Pick Lodge has some fantastic visual artists who really did a great job of giving the game style. The game has some absolutely gorgeous environments and character art. The architecture is fantastic and follows certain patterns to reflect the distribution of wealth in certain parts of town. There are some questionable artistic decisions, like the painting of a wounded mermaid bleeding out on the floor that you'll find in some houses, but the game does look nice overall considering what few resources the developers used. Character animations don't experience the same good fate, with facial expressions that make them look like invisible hands are trying to grab them, but this is more something amusing to mention than any problem of actual consequence. Apart from the music and some environmental sound effects, the sound design is pretty lacking. Voice acting is an especial problem, with a pretty large cast but only a handful who can deliver the main character's lines with any authenticity. And this isn't helped by the characters greeting you with sayings that I'm sure were perfectly fine in Russian, but just don't have enough sense to them in English.
What about my brother? Do you have any news from him?
On top of this, none of the common townspeople have any voice acting at all, for any event other than taking damage. It's a pretty odd discrepancy, but it's trumped by how appropriate and effective the musical score and environmental sound effects prove. If you've been keeping count, you'd realize that I have quite a few complaints about the game, but most of the faults stem from a lack of resources, and never any lack of creativity, ambition, or effort. Each element of the game has its flaws, but it ventures into a dramatically different direction from nearly all of gaming, and follows through with all of its promises. It tells just about the greatest, largest story ever, and backs it up by facing you with questions and decisions that challenge your knowledge and beliefs. It puts you in a cohesive and dynamic and dangerous world that exhausts you mentally as you do your damnedest to survive. Pathologic is a rare gem in the computer gaming world that is undoubtedly rough around the edges, but it makes something rich, creative, unconventional, and most importantly, exceedingly complex out of a formal computer system, and because of this, it's without a doubt one of gaming's greatest accomplishments.
Are you still a virgin?